There's a lot of drama around the new DMZ mode not having a PvE dedicated mode, but it's also brought up a lot of discussion around the topic and whether or not the mode needs it or not. I personally think it could benefit from a PvE mode, but I'll explain kind of how that part works because other games have tried this and it works very well in Tarkov. We'll talk a little bit about how that part works of it. Some of the common concerns are if it'll split the player base, it removes the tension, it defeats the purpose of an extraction shooter. Everyone will just farm loot safely and nobody will play the real mode anymore, which I'll go ahead and address each of those points. It's not whether a matter or not DMZ should have a PvE mode. I think it definitely should, but the real question is more, can they have a PvE mode without harming the PvE VP mode? And that's the bigger part that I think a lot of people get mixed up on. I think one of the foundational things about an extraction shooter is that PvP is definitely an essential component of an extraction shooter, and it definitely needs to be there. But I also think that if DMZ isn't fun without the PvP, that also creates another problem. I think they've already kind of solved for this. I think other extraction shooters really do struggle with this, and PvP ends up being like the blanket that's going to fix all the different engaging issues, and the emergent gameplay is going to be enough. The reality for me is that if you remove the PvP, which leads to emergent gameplay, not that they should, but in general, the PvE has to be enough to stand on its own. And then the PvP just adds to a little bit more exciting elements to it, a little bit more uncertainty to the mode, the ability for betrayal to happen, or maybe you make a truce and you turn on them. The game's still got to stand on its own two legs. So that means the looting should be good. The progression systems should be good. The missions should be good. The overall bosses, exploration, the certain amount of risk versus reward. How good is the AI? If they're trash AI, well, then the game's not good enough. I'm gonna be honest, it's not. It needs to be very rewarding, even without those elements. The resource management, how does that system interact? And PvP should be an amplifier of the base game, not replace them. And normally I would have been all of the mindset that your game cannot have a PvE mode and survive, but Tarkov has kind of proven this wrong. And I think not enough players, because it is a little bit more of a niche game that is played by a lot of people, but maybe people don't know the nuance of the modes to really understand what they're offering versus what people think of PvE when they think of it. From this, it has separate progression, separate inventory, separate stash, separate economy, no progression crossover. And for a lot of people, it also has no wipes, which sometimes as part of the mode, wipe fatigue can be a thing, especially if you play ARPGs like Diablo or Path of Exile. That fatigue can set in and you can have some issues related with that. And then the mode, even though it doesn't have PvP like other players on the map, still has AI that loads in as players, replacing those players. So that you still kind of have that idea of like, okay, here's how the AI behaves, and then this is how players behave. So they try to mimic it. So meaning that you can't get juiced up and just, you know, sweat out hours of PvE and then jump into PvP and be like, cool, I got the best gun, I got the best armor, I got the best streaks and the weapon. That's not how it works. I have all my skill points juiced out and I saved up this huge inventory. It doesn't work that way. Completely separate ecosystems. When Tarkov first came out, and why I bring this up is Tarkov initially said that they never would support a dedicated PvE mode, or they never envisioned that would be the case. That was the philosophy. Player interaction is what makes extraction shooters special, is what they said, which is 100% true, because they're not wrong on that. Tension of another player potentially being around the corner or anywhere you go on the map does add that layer of tension. But despite that thought process, they launched the PvE mode anyway, and they've maintained it because there's clearly a demand for it. And I think there's a lot of benefits to a PvE mode that people don't acknowledge. And it looks like what they learned is there's a large audience of people interested in extraction shooters without that part of the gameplay being real players. You can still mimic the intensity to a certain extent, and I think they've managed to do that. And if adding a PvE mode didn't just kill off the most hardcore extraction shooters on the market, I don't think it would automatically kill DMZ either. That brings us to the real problem of a PvE mode, and that's if you do shared progression. If you're allowing players to farm easier, like bosses easier, without the threat of another player just coming in and ruining that kill. That kind of defeats that purpose. If you allow them to earn the rare gear and use it in a PvP setting against other players, allow them to generate large pools of wealth, unlock all their upgrades, it just doesn't work. That's what destroys the mode, and how they've managed to do it versus how I think most people envision it is, I think a lot of people just think of it like a casual Warzone, which is just another playlist in the mode. All your progression counts, all the kills count, all your camos count. Everything you do in that mode literally counts. And people are viewing it that way when it needs to be a completely separate mode. And there's other differentiators that we'll also talk about that I think they do it pretty well. So if DMZ did it, they could do a separate stash, separate inventory, separate progression, separate economy that are completely separate. And it'll allow players to funnel in from a PvE mode into the PvP mode, because players enjoy the other 99% of the extraction shooter outside of the PvP element. They enjoy questing, looting, collections, boss hunting, long-term progression. And it's not like Tarkov created the PvE community. They were already there, just not being serviced. They weren't playing their PvP game. Maybe some of them, sure, will go like, you know what, I don't have a lot of time right now. I'm not going to play at the new wipe. I'm going to play my eternal character, and I'm just going to progress through that. And it allows them to just play at their own pace and engage with the game. And eventually might even be encouraged to jump into the PvP version of the game, because they have other distinctions, like content doesn't come out newest to the PvE mode. It doesn't. They get it later. So how I would imagine this for DMZ is it launches in its normal PvP state, like we expect it to do. And then when season 1 hits, they drop the PvE mode, which will be like the base version of the game without the new content. And you'll be like on a previous version of the game. And then if you decide, you know what, season 2's rolling around, I'm actually interested in some of that content, let me jump in day 1, and now you're in the PvP mode. So addressing one of the biggest concerns is it fractures the player base. And I've already touched on some of these talking points, but many of those players would have just quit the game. There's players who would have never tried the game. There's people that are out there looking for co-op gameplay with their friends as a casual experience, would not have played it. Many older casual gamers just wouldn't have touched it. And players that were maybe interested in the idea of the progression but aren't really all that competitive wouldn't have touched the game. And these are being funneled in and being supported in a way that they basically didn't have a way to exist. So suddenly, instead of what a lot of people think are just stealing from the PvP player pool, it's adding to the overall net number of players. And many players will funnel towards that mode that wouldn't have been in the game in general. And then a percentage of them will funnel to the PvP experience for a plethora of reasons, whether it's the content, maybe they feel a little bit more comfortable, maybe they like the gameplay loop more than they thought, and it actually fosters like a healthy like player base to continue to grow and have an area to get experience to the game. This is one of those things that casual ended up supporting for Warzone, even though I don't like the way it was executed. There's other things that have been done in Fortnite that kind of supplemented this. Arc Raiders experimenting with some stuff. Marathon experimenting with some stuff. And it seems like there's a thought process around it, that there's an actual like fulfillment there, because over time your player base can just get smaller. Because if you're telling somebody who doesn't really want PvP, they run into a cheater for the first time, they're like, screw this game. Instead of going to the PvE mode, they just stop playing your game entirely. Maybe they stay playing the PvE, the anti-cheat gets an update, and the word on the street is like, ooh, it's way better. Maybe they'll jump back into PvP. So there's different systems there that it's going to help that aspect of the game. The other part is Call of Duty has a big advantage that Tarkov never had. DMZ is going to have a big advantage that it has the Call of Duty ecosystem. There's people that are going to be playing multiplayer. There's people that play the campaign. There's people that were former Spec Ops people or like enjoyed the raids in the previous game. There's Warzone players. And they'll have this opportunity where maybe they're like initially off the bat, they're not really interested in the PvP side of it. Maybe they'll give it a shot. But the reality is if that option was available, they would 100% try it and then have the potential to funnel into the other player pool to kind of foster that community so that you have that. And personally, just from my personal experience, PvP, I think is much more fun when you're shooting people that want to PvP. Like, it's kind of like weird to even put a PvE player in the PvP mode where you just dumpster them because they don't even want a PvE. And that's kind of one of the problems I ran in with Arc Raiders is if you remove those PvE-ish players from the player pool, then I would feel like more satisfied just PvPing, because it always felt like, oh, don't shoot. Oh, it's like that player doesn't even want to be in a PvP. Like, that doesn't feel rewarding at all or satisfying. I'm sure some people get a kick out of like kicking a dog when they're down or whatever. Like, there's clearly a skill discrepancy on that. But for me, I never enjoyed that aspect of the game. So maybe I'm off on that end. But PvP, it would essentially be that training ground as well, where you can go in and maybe you're in the PvP side of it and you're enjoying that and you're like, dude, I don't really feel comfortable with this particular commander or lead or lieutenant or whatever the hell the game's going to offer. Maybe there's specific mechanics that are like death mechanics, like that we've seen in other games and in Zombies is done, where like if you don't do this thing, you die and that's it, like over, GG's. Maybe people want to experiment with this, and we've seen this in ARPGs. This is like Diablo and also PoE, where people will go in and maybe they practice a specific boss because it has mechanics. I don't think COD's going to be that complicated in terms of mechanics, but maybe they will. And then you can kind of play on your alternate character, get some reps in. So when you go in the real thing, you'll do the real thing, but there's also the threat of the PvP player there because you like that experience, but more as a training ground to get more comfortable with it. And get used to the systems so that it doesn't feel like there's a huge skill disparity between you and the other PvP players as well. And I think if IW eventually decided they want this to exist, I know they've already stated, hey, we're not going to do a PvE mode. Tarkov said the thing and they changed their mind on that. And Warzone, I don't think ever envisioned having a casual mode, but that got changed up quite a bit. If they ever do it, I think it needs to be clear that there's separate progression, separate stash, separate inventory, all those things. Long-term progression is going to be separate. If they decide to do wipes, which haven't been announced or fully like done away with, because I think initially when the DMZ beta came out, there wasn't supposed to be wipes, but then they ended up doing a wipe like after season 2 or something like that. I don't remember the exact timing, but they ended up doing it. So maybe the plans could change based off user feedback. I'm not 100% sure. And they could potentially just delay content the way I've said, where maybe like the same concept of directed in Zombies, they get the content a little bit later, and directed is basically kind of like a tutorialized version of the game to really funnel people into the bigger mode, because you want it to have the legs to stand, but we don't want to sacrifice the way the game's balanced for the PvP side of it just because there's a casual. And I think that's where casual Warzone messed up, is there's a lot of systems in place that just do not function well when you transfer over to the standard PvP, and the theory of it didn't translate well either. And tying it back to my original thoughts is it's not really whether or not DMZ should have a PvE mode. I think it's, can DMZ support a PvE mode without compromising the PvE mode? And I think based on how Tarkov did it, it's possible. And not only possible, it's pretty straightforward. I don't know about the logistical side of what it would cost resources for IW to do it. Maybe that's the bigger hurdle, but I think there's a lot of way more benefits to having the mode than drawbacks. And I think you got to be pretty confident in your mode's ability to stand on its own without PvP. Kind of reiterating what I said also earlier, that if they can't stand on its own and PvP isn't the enhancer, then there's fundamentally something wrong with your game. And Tarkov has demonstrated this well, at least in my opinion. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.